I'm Marlo Quinn. I'm 46 years old, and I spent 20 years letting my flying do the talking so I would never have to argue for a seat I had already earned. For 2 decades, I carried a call sign a whole squadron handed me on the worst day of my life, and I carried it quietly. But when a senior chief looked at me in my own wardroom, decided I was nobody, and asked for my call sign as a joke in front of a room full of officers, I had a choice to make about the kind of commander I was going to be. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who had no idea who you were? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to keep your dignity while someone underestimated you to your face, hit that like button and subscribe. The ready room was cold at 0500 hours, the way those rooms always are before the day fills them. I stood at the bottom of the brow in the dark, looking up at 4.5 acres of gray steel that would be mine by noon, and I let myself feel the size of it for exactly 1 minute. Then I picked up my helmet bag and started up. People think a call sign is a nickname. It is not. It is a verdict. A squadron watches what you do on the day the wheels come off, when the weather is bad and the fuel is low and nobody is coming to help you, and then it hands you a name whether you want it or not. You do not get to choose it. You do not get to argue with it. You wear it because a room full of people who were there decided it was true. I had worn mine for 20 years. Most of the people who would salute me that morning had never seen my face. They had seen a slide. I was born in 1980 in a town where nobody flew anything but crop dusters, and I did not grow up dreaming about carriers. What I grew up with was the certainty that I would have to prove myself twice for every man who had to prove himself once. And I decided early that I would rather do the proving in the air than in an argument. Arguments you can lose to the loudest voice in the room. Flying you cannot fake. The jet does not care who your father was or what anybody thinks a woman can do. The jet only cares whether you are good. I remember the day that idea got put into words for me. It was 2002 at Annapolis, and I was 22 years old and about to be commissioned. There was a wall in one of the buildings with the class photographs going back a century, row after row of young faces, almost all of them men. An old instructor caught me looking at it. He was a leathery man who had flown in a war I only knew from books, and he did not give me a speech about barriers or history. He gave me one sentence. "The jet doesn't know you're a woman, Quinn," he said. "Make sure it never has to." I have turned that sentence over 10,000 times since. Some days I thought it was the wisest thing anyone ever told me. Some days I thought it was a cruelty dressed up as advice because it meant the burden was always going to be mine to carry silently. But it was honest, and honesty was in short supply for a young woman in a flight suit, so I took it and I kept it. 2 years later, I earned my wings of gold. I was 24. They pinned the wings on my chest in a hanger that smelled of jet fuel and floor wax, and my mother cried, and I made myself a private promise standing there at attention. I would not spend my career explaining myself. I would outfly the doubt instead of debating it. Let them wonder if I belonged. I would answer at 400 knots and let the answer speak for itself. There was a flight instructor in the training command who did not think women belonged in fighters, and he did not bother to hide it. He rode me harder than anyone in my class, picked apart landings that the men got waved through on, found a flaw in every hop and made me fly it again. I could have filed something. Half my instructors would have backed me if I had. Instead, I flew every hop he threw at me, and I flew it better the second time. And at the end of the syllabus, he signed my papers without a word, and that silence was the closest thing to an apology a man like that could manage. I did not need him to like me. I needed him to sign, and he signed because the flying left him nothing else to do. That was the lesson underneath the lesson. You do not change a closed mind by arguing with it. You change it by being undeniable. And sometimes you do not change it at all, and you fly past it anyway. Either way, the work is the same. Either way, you show up at 0400 hours, and you brief, and you fly, and you debrief, and you do it again. And one morning you look up, and you have a career that nobody signed off on because they liked you. For a long time, that promise served me well. It also cost me more than I understood at the time. When you decide that your work will be your only argument, you also decide to be alone with a great many things. You do not complain. You do not tell people how hard it was. You just fly, and you let them draw their own conclusions, and you find out that a lot of them never draw the right one. I gave things up for it that I have never listed for anyone, because listing them sounds like complaint, and I do not complain. I gave up the ordinary geography of a life, the town you stay in, the friends you keep for 30 years, the ability to answer the question of where you are from with a single word. I gave up a marriage that could not survive the deployments, and I do not blame him for it, because I was gone more than I was home, and I was guarded even when I was home. I missed funerals, I missed weddings, I sent cards from ports whose names my family could not pronounce. And I told myself every time that the work was worth it, that the flying was worth it, that a person is allowed to give her whole self to one thing if the thing is large enough. The flying was large enough. I still believe that. But nobody tells you that the bill for giving your whole self to one thing is paid in all the selves you might have been, and that the bill comes due quietly on ordinary nights, on a catwalk over a black sea 20 years after the flight that named you. There was one day that made all of it real, one day that took a green lieutenant and turned her into a name. It happened over a desert 2 years after I got my wings, and it started with a young man named Beckett Lowe on my wing, and it ended with the whole ready room deciding who I was. I have told that story 100 times to 100 classrooms since, and every time I tell it, I am standing at the bottom of that brow again in the cold 20 years of flying behind me and one more room full of strangers ahead. It was 2006. I was 26, a lieutenant, and we launched as a flight of 3 into a sky that the weather brief had lied about. The forecast promised clear. The desert delivered a wall of sand that came up off the ground like the world had decided to close for the night. We were supporting troops who needed us on station, so we pressed, the way you do, telling yourself the weather will hold, right up until it does not. Our flight lead took a bird strike low over the target area. Not a missile, not a lucky shot from the ground, just an ordinary bird at an extraordinary speed, and his engine came apart. He got out clean and came down in friendly territory, and we would learn that night that he was fine. But in the moment, all I knew was that my lead was gone, and the sky was turning to soup, and there were 2 of us left. The second thing that went wrong was worse. Beckett Lowe was the junior man in the flight, 22 years old and barely out of the training command, and when the lead's jet disintegrated, it threw debris through the murk, and some of it found Lowe's aircraft. His jet was hurt. Worse than the jet, Lowe was hurt, a hard knock to the head that left him slow and confused on the radio. And there's nothing in the world more frightening than a wingman whose voice has gone wrong. We had no tanker where we needed one. The divert fields I might have trusted were on the wrong side of the storm. Between the 2 of us in the boat, there was a sandstorm the size of a small country, and I was the only one left who could see straight. I have been asked many times what went through my mind. People want it to be dramatic. The truth is that it went very quiet. Everything that was not the next 30 seconds simply switched off. I got my jet onto Lowe's wing so close that I could see the damage on his aircraft, and I started talking to him the way you talk to someone standing on a ledge, low and steady and without a single wasted word. "I can't see the boat," Lowe said. His voice was thick. "I can't see anything." "You don't have to see it," I told him. "You have to see me. Fly my wing and I'll take you home." And he did. For 40 minutes he flew formation on a jet he could barely make out. Through a sky with no horizon and no ground and no sky, while I flew for both of us, watching his airplane and my instruments and nothing else in the world. I coached him through the worst of it, one heartbeat at a time. There is a particular kind of tired that comes from flying formation in weather you cannot see through. Your eyes want a horizon, and there is none. So your inner ear starts lying to you, telling you that you are turning when you are level, telling you that up is a direction you can no longer trust. Every instinct in your body wants to believe the feeling instead of the instruments, and the whole discipline of flying is teaching yourself, over years, to believe the instruments and call the feeling a liar. Now imagine doing that for 2 aircraft at once. Imagine holding your own vertigo at arm's length while you talk a concussed man out of his. I kept my voice level because his life was tied to it. If I sounded afraid, he would be afraid, and a frightened pilot in weather flies into the sea. So I found the flattest, most bored tone I owned, the tone you would use to read a grocery list, and I read him home with it. Left 2 degrees, hold what you have. You are doing fine, Beckett. You are doing fine. When the storm finally thinned and the gray shape of the carrier appeared in the murk below us like something rising out of the sea, I did not feel triumphant. I felt like I had been holding my breath for a year. We both got aboard. Lo went to medical and recovered. That night, in the ready room, somebody said it. Half joking and entirely serious, the way the best call signs always arrive. She flew home alone. Lone lady. It stuck before the sun came up. The debrief that night was the quietest I ever sat through. Normally, a ready room after a flight like that is loud, all the nervous energy pouring out as noise and bravado. This one was not. The skipper walked through it, beat by beat, the lost lead, the debris, the weather, the recovery, and when he got to the part where I put my airplane on Lo's wing and did not leave, he stopped, and he looked at me for a moment across the room, and he did not say anything at all. He just nodded once and moved on. I have received medals since with less weight in them than that single nod. A room of aviators who knew exactly how the day could have ended, deciding without a vote that I had done the thing you were supposed to do and hoping they never have to. I did not choose it, and for years I was not sure I liked it. There's a loneliness folded into that name that I never wanted to advertise. But the squadron had spoken, and the squadron is never wrong about these things, so I wore it. What I did not expect was what happened to the story after it stopped being mine. Somewhere in the years that followed, the flight became a lesson. In 2014, I was an instructor at the Navy Fighter Weapons School. 34 years old, standing at the back of a darkened classroom, when a student raised his hand during a lecture I was not even giving, and asked the instructor at the front, "Sir, is that the Lone Lady flight? Is that a real one?" It was a real one. It was mine. And there I stood at the back of the room, and not one head turned, because everyone remembers the call sign and almost no one remembers the face that goes with it. I learned to live in that gap. I learned that being a legend on paper is very nearly the opposite of being recognized in a room. My name glowed on a training slide in the dark while I stood behind the last row of chairs, unrecognized. And I understood something that would take me another 12 years to say out loud. You can be famous and invisible at the same time. I had made a whole career out of the space between the two. The pattern did not stop when I got senior. People assume that rank fixes it, that once you have enough stripes, the underestimating ends. It does not. It only changes costume. In 2010, I was a lieutenant commander and a department head, and a visiting officer at a conference handed me his empty coffee cup because he assumed the only woman near the podium was there to refill it. In 2016, I took command of a strike fighter squadron, 300 and some sailors, and a dozen aircraft that were now my responsibility. And on my first day, a contractor at the gate asked to speak to the commanding officer, and when I told him he was speaking to her, he laughed because he thought I was joking. I stopped being surprised by it somewhere in there. I started treating it the way you treat weather. It is going to happen. It is not personal, even when it feels personal. You do not get angry at a storm. You just fly through it, and you do not let it put you in the sea. So when I climbed that brow at 0500 hours in the summer of 2026, 46 years old, and about to take command of an entire air wing, I was not naive about what waited for me. I knew that the call sign had gone ahead of me and the face had not. I knew that somewhere on that ship there would be a person who looked at an unfamiliar woman in a plain flight suit and decided in half a second that she did not matter. I just did not know it would happen before breakfast. I came aboard quietly on purpose. My change of command was set for that afternoon, all the ceremony and the side boys and the long speeches, and I wanted a few hours before all of that to walk the ship the way it actually was when nobody was performing. So I did not put on the uniform with the eagles on the collar. I put on a flight suit with the patches stripped off, the way you keep a spare, and I went looking for the wardroom because you learn more about a squadron in 5 minutes of its wardroom than in 5 hours of its paperwork. The wardroom was warm and full of the smell of coffee and eggs, and it was loud in the easy way a room gets when the people in it are comfortable. Junior officers filled the tables, a few of them still blinking themselves awake. And at the center of the room, holding court from a chair he had tipped back on 2 legs, was a senior chief with a coffee cup in one hand and an audience in the other. I would learn his name within the hour. Wade Hollis, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Aviation Administration, the man who ran the paperwork for half the ready rooms on the ship. I would learn that he was genuinely good at his job. that he had 22 years in and knew the system cold, and that somewhere along the way he had come to enjoy the sound of a room laughing at whatever he pointed it at. But in that first moment, I knew none of that. I only saw a comfortable man scanning the door, and I watched his eyes land on me and do the arithmetic that I had watched 1,000 pairs of eyes do before his. Unfamiliar woman, plain flight suit, no name he recognized, therefore nobody. "Lost, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the room. "Coffee mess is aft." A few people chuckled, not all of them. I had learned to read those laughs a long time ago, and this one had the nervous edge of people laughing because the loud man expected it, not because anything was funny. I set my helmet bag down by the bulkhead and did not answer right away, which only encouraged him because a man playing to a room hates a silence more than he hates a rival. There was a young officer at the table nearest him, a lieutenant junior grade with tired eyes, and her hands wrapped around a mug like she was cold, and I watched Hollis glance at her the way a man glances at a prop he has used before. "Ortiz here can show you where the enlisted spaces are," he said, and the young woman flinched, just slightly, the flinch of someone who has been the punchline all week and has stopped expecting it to end. I felt something settle in me then. It was not anger, exactly. Anger is loud, and this was quiet. It was the old, familiar recognition of a room deciding what I was before I had said a word. And underneath it, a colder note, because he had reached past me to take a swing at a kid who could not swing back. Hollis mistook my stillness for confusion, and he decided to be generous with it. He set the front legs of his chair down and spread his hands like a man about to do a card trick for children. "Tell you what," he said, grinning, working the room one more time. "Give us your call sign and we'll find your squadron." The room laughed a little, waiting for me to stammer that I did not have one, that I was a contractor, a reservist, somebody's forgotten guest. That was the joke. The joke was that a woman like me could not possibly have a call sign worth saying out loud. I looked at him for a moment, then I said it, the way you say a thing you have carried for 20 years, without heat, without weight, just true. Lone lady. I have thought a great deal about the 2 seconds that followed, because they were the closest thing to silence I have ever heard in a room full of people. The laughter did not fade. It stopped all at once, like a switch had been thrown. At the head table, an older captain had been reading a message folder and drinking his coffee, paying no attention to any of it. That was Isaac Thorne, the commanding officer of the ship. 52 years old and not a man who rose for much. He set down his cup, and then, without hurry and without drama, he stood. "Attention on deck," Thorne said quietly in a voice that carried anyway, "for the incoming air wing commander." Halfway down the room, a commander came to his feet so fast his chair rocked. I knew him before I fully saw him, the way you know a voice in the dark. Beckett Lowe, 42 now, gray coming into his hair, the junior man I had flown home through a sandstorm 2 decades before, standing at attention with his coffee forgotten and something in his face that was not surprise. It was the opposite of surprise. It was a man watching the rest of a room finally see what he had known for 20 years. And then the whole wardroom stood. Chairs scraped back all at once. A sound like a wave pulling gravel off a beach. 40 officers on their feet in the space of a breath. The young lieutenant, junior grade, Ortiz, was up with the rest of them, her tired eyes wide now, looking from me to Hollis and back. Hollis rose too, because a body rises when a room rises, but he rose the way a man rises through cold water, half out of his chair with the coffee cup still in his hand and no idea what to do with it. He looked at me. I looked back at him. I did not smile and I did not scowl. I simply let him stand there in the middle of everything he had counted on, and let him understand, with no help from me, exactly what he had just done and to whom. I let the room hold its position for a moment longer than it strictly needed to. Not to punish anyone. To let the truth take up all the space it wanted, because for 20 years I had made my truth small so it would fit into the gaps other people left me. Then I looked around at all of them, at 40 faces I did not yet know, but would come to lead, and I gave the only order the moment called for. "As you were," I said. "Please, sit. Finish your breakfast." They sat, slowly, the way a room does when it is not sure the show is over. Beckett Lowe did not sit. He crossed the wardroom to me, 20 years folding down into 10 steps, and he put out his hand. And when I took it, the handshake turned into something that was not quite a salute and not quite an embrace. The thing men of a certain restraint do when the alternative is to show too much. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was rough. He turned to the room, still holding my hand, and he did not grandstand, because Beckett never did. He just told them the truth in the plainest words he had. "You want to know who this is?" he said. "She's the reason I'm standing here. 2006. I was hit. My jet was hurt. I couldn't see the boat. I couldn't see anything. She put her airplane on my wing and she talked me home through a storm that should have killed both of us. Every one of you flies in this wing because she didn't leave me out there." He looked at Hollis then, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than if he had glared. "That's Lone Lady." Nobody laughed. The coffee cups sat where they were. Hollis had finally set his down. I could have taken the room right then. I could have said something sharp and let it land on him and walked out to the sound of 40 people enjoying his humiliation. There is a version of me that wanted to. But I have led long enough to know that the word costs nothing when you already outrank everyone in the compartment. And a thing that costs nothing is worth exactly that. So I did not spend it. "Thank you, Beckett," I said. "It's good to fly with you again." And then I picked up my helmet bag, and I told them I would see the officers on the flight deck that afternoon, and I walked out, and I did not look at Hollis on my way past. Not because I was above it, because the person I was thinking about was not him. My aide caught up with me in the passageway. Lieutenant Harriet Bellow, 31, sharp as a tack and loyal to a fault, and she had come aboard the day before to set up my office. She had heard the whole thing from the doorway, and she was quietly, thoroughly furious. "Ma'am," she said, matching my stride, "give me the word, and Senior Chief Hollis is on report by lunch." That was contempt toward a superior officer in front of 40 witnesses. I can have the paperwork drafted before you finish your coffee. I kept walking for a few steps. The passageway was narrow and gray and smelled of the ship, and I let the anger in her voice hang there because it was honest and she had earned the right to feel it on my behalf. "He didn't know I was a superior officer," I said. "That's the whole point, Harriet. He wasn't being contemptuous of a captain. He was being contemptuous of a woman he thought was nobody. Writing him up for the first one lets him off the hook for the second. So he gets away with it. I didn't say that." I stopped at a hatch and looked at her. "I said the word costs nothing when you outrank everyone. That's exactly why I'm not going to spend it yet. If I break him this morning, then for the rest of his life, the story he tells himself is that he got unlucky, that the wrong woman walked into the room. I don't want him to think he got unlucky. I want him to think about what he did." Bellow did not look satisfied, but she was smart enough to file it. "Yes, ma'am." "There's someone I'm more interested in," I said. I had been turning it over since the wardroom. "The young one, the lieutenant junior grade he used as a prop. Ortiz. Find out about her, quietly." Because that was the thread, not the loud man who mocked me. I have been mocked by louder men than Wade Hollis, and I will be again. The thing that had reached into me and taken hold was smaller, and it mattered more. It was the flinch of a young pilot who had been the punchline so many times she had stopped expecting the joke to end. I knew that flinch. I had spent a career refusing to let anyone see mine, and I had just watched a comfortable man teach a good kid that this was the price of showing up. That was the thing I meant to fix. The antagonist takes care of himself. It is always the ones he steps on that need you. The change of command that afternoon was everything the morning had not been. Where the wardroom had been warm and human and unguarded, the flight deck was formal to the bone. The side boys, the boatswain's pipe, the flags snapping in a hard sea wind. Hundreds of sailors in ranks under a sky that had finally decided to be blue. My predecessor read his orders. I read mine. The wing changed hands the way it has changed hands for as long as there have been wings, by the reading of words that mean a life is now your responsibility. Then I stepped to the microphone to say the few things a new commander is allowed to say, and I looked out at all of them, and I saw Wade Hollis in the ranks near the back, standing at attention, waiting for the axe. I could see it in the set of his shoulders. He had spent the morning learning who I was, and he had spent the afternoon certain that the podium was where I would end him in front of the entire ship. I did not name him. I never named him, not that day or any day after, from any podium. But I said the thing I had come to say, and I said it looking at the whole wing, and I trusted him to know that a part of it was for him. You will be handed rank in this Navy, I said. You will pin it on, and it will be real, and it will mean people have to do what you say. But I want to be very clear with the wing I am privileged to take command of today. You will never be handed respect, not once, not by me, not by anyone. Respect is the one thing in this service you cannot be issued. You earn it in the dark, when the weather is bad and nobody is watching and there is no audience to play to, and you earn it again the next day and the next. If anyone in my wing ever confuses the two, if anyone ever mistakes the rank they were given for the respect they never earned, they will hear about it from me, once and quietly. I let that sit, then I told them the story, briefly because they had heard the loud version already and I wanted them to have the true one. But I did not tell it the way the training slide tells it. The slide makes it about me, about a lieutenant who flew home alone through a storm, and that is the part people like because it is dramatic. I told them the part that actually matters. They call me Lone Lady, I said. I earned that name on the worst day of my life. But I have never once thought it was a story about me flying home alone. It is a story about a 22-year-old who could not see the boat, who could not see anything, and who chose to trust a voice he could not verify and put his life on the wing of an airplane he could barely make out. It is a story about trust. That is how this wing is going to run. Not on fear, on trust. You will trust each other in the weather, and you will earn the right to be trusted, and that is the whole job. When I stepped back from the microphone, Wade Hollis was still standing at attention in the back, and I watched the thing I had wanted to happen begin to happen on his face. He had come to that flight deck braced for destruction, and the destruction had not come. And a man braced for a blow that never lands does not feel relief. He feels something far more uncomfortable. He feels seen. There is a cruelty in refusing to punish a man who mocked you, and I will not pretend I did not know it. The cruelest thing you can do to a person who tried to make you his excuse is to refuse the role. I would not be the wrong woman who walked into his wardroom. I would just be his commander, watching, declining to become the villain that would have let him off. After the ceremony, in the quiet that comes when the crowd disperses and the flags come down, I found the young lieutenant junior grade, Selene Ortiz, 26 years old, a nugget aviator on her first sea tour, and Bello had told me the rest of it in a sentence. Good hands, struggling, nearly dropped on request to leave flight status 2 days before. She came to attention when she saw me, too fast, the way you do when you are afraid. At ease, I said. Walk with me. We walked the length of the flight deck with the sea sliding by, and for a while I did not say anything, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a frightened person is not require them to perform. Finally, she said it because it had been sitting in her all week, and I was the first senior officer who had not needed anything from her. I almost dropped my wings this week, ma'am, she said very quietly, watching the deck. I put in the paperwork, I pulled it back. I don't know if I pulled it back for the right reasons. I did not tell her it would be all right. I did not tell her she was talented, though she was. I have learned that a young person drowning does not need a compliment. They need a hand and a job. You want to know something? I said. This morning a very confident man told me I was in the wrong room. He was sure of it. He had an audience and everything. She looked up at that, startled into something close to a laugh. It has happened to me my whole career, Ortiz. It will happen to you. People will look at you and decide, before you have said one word, that you are less than you are. You cannot stop them from deciding it. You can only decide what you do next. What do you do next? You fly anyway, I said. That's it. That's the whole secret, and it is not much of a secret. You keep your dignity and you do the work and you let the flying be the argument. You almost dropped your wings. So did I, about 6 times, and nobody knew because I did not tell them. You and I are going to fly anyway. She stood a little straighter. It was not a transformation. Nobody is transformed in an afternoon on a flight deck. But something in her shoulders came up 1/2 inch and stayed there. And I have led long enough to know that 1/2 inch is where it starts. The story ran the ship faster than any report I could have filed. That is the thing Wade Hollis had never understood, standing in the middle of his wardroom performing for a crowd. The crowd is not loyal to you. The crowd is loyal to the story, and the moment the story turns, so does the crowd, and there is nothing you can write on a piece of paper that moves through a ship half as fast as a good story about a proud man and a quiet woman. By the second day, the chief's mess knew. By the third, the mess decks knew, and the ready rooms, and the maintenance bases. Nobody said a word to Hollis officially. He never got so much as a raised voice from a superior. What he got was the temperature of a ship changing around him 1 degree at a time, which is worse because you cannot fight a temperature. He would tell a story in the chief's mess the way he always had, working toward the laugh, and the laugh would come a beat late and a little thin. A junior sailor he had impressed for years simply stopped meeting his eye. He told me later what that week was like from the inside, and I believed him because he told it against himself. He said the strange part was that nobody confronted him. He kept waiting for someone to say something so that he could argue back, could explain, could turn it into a disagreement he might win. Nobody gave him the fight. The mess just got a little cooler around him, a degree at a time, the conversations closing up when he approached the way water closes over a stone. He said he found himself talking louder to fill the space and hearing how loud he sounded and not being able to stop. A man who has built his whole standing on being the center of the room does not know how to be in a room he is no longer the center of. He said he lay awake doing math on 22 years of service and could not find the moment it had gone wrong, because there was no moment. It was 1,000 small mornings of choosing the laugh over the sailor, and no single one of them had felt like a crime, and all of them together had made him into someone he did not want his own daughter to meet. It was another chief who finally said the thing to his face. A senior master chief, the most senior enlisted man in Hollis's world, a man Hollis had wanted to be like for 20 years, took him aside in a passageway with no audience anywhere near. "Nobody's going to hang you for it, Wade," the senior master chief said. "You know that, right? The captain's not going to do a thing. That's the problem. Nobody's going to make you look at it. So you're going to have to look at it yourself with nobody standing over you and figure out what kind of chief you turned into when you weren't paying attention." Hollis did not have an answer. He told me all of this much later, and he told it plainly without trying to make himself look better, which is the only reason I believed him. He said he went back to his rack that night and could not sleep, and that the thing that kept him up was not fear of punishment, because there was none coming, but the sound of the wardroom laughing replayed in his head with the volume turned down, so that for the first time he could hear how it actually sounded. He said it did not sound like respect. It sounded like a man being funny at the expense of a kid, and getting a room to go along with it, and calling that being liked. A few days after that, in the ordinary churn of the paperwork he administered, my service record crossed his desk. Routine, a form that needed a signature block updated. And Wade Hollis, who had been moving records for 2 decades and had learned to read them without reading them, stopped and actually read mine. He read what the flight in 2006 had cost and what it had saved. He read the citation for the Distinguished Flying Cross, the flat official language that drains all the drama out of the worst day of a person's life and leaves only the facts. He read the facts, and then he closed the folder and sat with it, and the wardroom played again in his head. Quieter still. I never had to lift a finger against him. I want that understood, because it is the part people find hardest to believe. The mess he had counted on for cover was the same mess that quietly stepped back. He built his standing on being the loudest, most confident man in the room, and it turned out that standing was borrowed and the room called the loan. It was Hollis who asked to see me, not the other way around. He came to my office some 10 days into it and stood in the passageway, and Bello, who does not forgive easily and had not forgiven him at all, wanted to tell him the CAG was unavailable. I told her to let him in. He stood in front of my desk with his cover in his hands, and he did not sit. And he did not make an excuse, which I had not expected. I have heard a great many apologies in my career, and most of them are really requests. This one was not. "I mocked you in your own wardroom, ma'am," he said, "the morning you reported aboard. I don't have an excuse. That's what I came to say. I keep trying to find one, and there isn't one. I had an audience, and I wanted the laugh. And I took it off of you and off of a junior officer, and that's worse than not having an excuse. Having an audience is the reason, and it's the worst reason there is." I let him stand there for a moment, the way I had let him stand in the wardroom, though for a different purpose now. "It was worse," I agreed. I did not soften it, because softening it would have been for my comfort, not his growth. "You want to know the part that actually mattered to me, Chief? It was not what you said to me. I have been called a lost sweetheart by better men than you, and I will be again, and it rolls off. The part that mattered is that you needed a prop for your joke, and you reached past me and you used a lieutenant junior grade who is 26 years old and was 2 days from dropping her wings. She paid for your audience, not me. I outrank every person in that compartment. She had nothing. The apology you actually owe is not to me." He was quiet. Then he said, "Ortiz? Ortiz, how do I?" He stopped. "Where do I even start with that, ma'am?" "You start where you did the damage," I said. "You did it in front of a room. That is where you fix it. Not because I am ordering you to grovel. I am not. You are going to do it because the only apology worth anything is one that cost you the same coin you spent, and you spent hers in public." He did it. I did not watch because it was not mine to watch, and turning it into a spectacle would have made it about me. But I heard about it, the way you hear about everything on a ship. He went into the ready room where he had needled her for weeks in front of the same faces he had performed for. And he told Selena Ortiz that he had been wrong, that he had used her to get a laugh, that a good officer does not do that to another sailor, and he had done it to her more than once, and that he was sorry. No qualifiers, no but. It cost him in front of the exact audience whose approval he had chased, and the cost was the point. Ortiz told me later that the hardest part was not being angry. She said she had wanted to hate him and could not, because a man saying a true thing in front of a room that would rather he did not is difficult to hate. What surprised me more was what it did to the room. I had expected the ready room to enjoy it, the way rooms enjoy watching a proud man brought low, and if they had, I would have counted the whole thing a failure, because a public apology that becomes a public humiliation teaches everyone watching to never apologize at all. But the room did not enjoy it. The room went quiet and a little uncomfortable, and then, when he was done, it did the decent thing, which was to let it be over. Nobody piled on, nobody made it a story to tell later, at his expense. They watched a chief do a hard, honest thing, and some of them, I think, went back to their own racks that night and thought about a hard, honest thing they had been avoiding. That is the part nobody tells you about leadership. When you make one person do the right thing in front of a crowd and you do it without cruelty, the crowd learns the right thing is survivable. That is worth more than any single apology. That is how a culture actually turns. I did not stop there, and I want to be honest that I did not do the next part out of tenderness. I did it because a wing needs its chiefs, and a chief with Wade Hollis's competence is worth too much to throw over the side. And the surest way to waste him would have been to leave him small. I called him back and I gave him a job that was the opposite of the one he had built his whole personality around. "I don't need you smaller, Chief," I told him. "That's the mistake everybody expects me to make. Everybody wants me to grind you down until you're quiet. I don't need you quiet. I need you useful. You know this system better than any officer in my wing. So you are going to stop performing for the junior sailors, and you are going to start teaching them, the ones you used to impress. Give them the 22 years instead of the punchlines. There's a difference between a chief who wants an audience and a chief who builds sailors, and you are going to learn it because you are too good at your job for me to let you keep wasting it on being liked." He looked at me for a long moment. I think it was the first time in years anyone had told him he was worth more than his act. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The deployment closed around us the way a deployment does, weeks becoming a rhythm, the ship a small gray country moving across a very large ocean, and the wing settled into the way I meant to run it. Change on a ship is rarely announced. It is felt. And what I felt, as the weeks stacked up, was a wing learning that it could trust itself. Selena Ortiz was the clearest measure of it. One night deep into the deployment, during flight operations, I stood at the back of a ready room and watched her brief a section for a night event, and the young woman who had wrapped her hands around a coffee mug like she was cold was gone. In her place was an aviator. She stood at the front of the room and walked 3 other pilots through the plan with a calm that you cannot fake and cannot teach, only grow. And near the end, she said a thing that stopped me where I stood. "If you lose sight of the boat out there tonight," Ortiz told them, "you don't panic. You find your lead and you fly the wing. Sight picture on your lead, trust the person next to you, and you'll all come home. That's the whole job." She did not know I was in the room. She did not say it for me. She said it because she believed it now, and she had learned it from a story that had become, somewhere along the way, her own. I watched her fly that night from the tower, her section going out into the black and coming back down the glide path, one after another, each recovery a small violence of steel and cable. And I watched her jet catch the wire and stop, and I let myself feel something I do not often let myself feel, which is that this was the actual job. Not the medals, not the slide, not the call sign. The job was standing in a dark tower watching a frightened kid turn into an aviator who could turn the next frightened kid. Everything else was scenery. I had spent 20 years thinking the flying was the point, and the flying is wonderful, and I would give almost anything to be young enough to do it the way she was doing it now. But the flying was never the point. The point was the wing. The point was that she would fly home, and she would teach someone else to fly home, and none of them would have to do it alone, and the long chain of that would outlast every name on every slide in every dark classroom, including mine. Hollis changed too, though more slowly and more quietly, the way an older person changes. One night a pilot was very nearly grounded by an administrative error, a qualification that had lapsed in the system through no fault of the pilot's, the kind of thing that would have pulled a good aviator off the flight schedule for a week while the paperwork caught up. Hollis caught it. He caught it late at night, with no audience anywhere. Going through records nobody had asked him to check, and he fixed it before it ever became a problem, and he did not tell a single soul he had done it. I only knew because I make it my business to know. I said nothing to him about it. I noted it. That is what respect actually looks like when it is finally being earned instead of demanded. It happens in the dark when nobody's watching and there's no laugh to chase. And I did my own reckoning in the way you do on a long deployment when the ship is asleep and flying at the same time. There's a catwalk on the side of the flight deck where you can stand at night with the black sea sliding by below and the whole Enterprise humming around you, jets recovering behind you in the dark, and I stood there more than one night and weighed the thing the call sign had named. Lone Lady. 20 years I had carried it, and 20 years I had told myself I was proud of it, and standing on that catwalk, I finally let myself admit that the name had always had a bruise in it. It was never a compliment about being alone. It was the price of a single terrible day. And somewhere I had let the price become a philosophy. I would outfly the doubt instead of arguing with it. I would let the work speak. I would carry the hard things silently and let no one see the flinch. All of that had made me good, and all of that had made me lonely. And the wardroom had shown me the two were not the same thing and never had been. I thought about my mother, who cried at my winging and did not entirely understand what I did for a living, and who used to ask me on the phone whether I had made any friends, as though friends were the thing I was missing, and I had always brushed the question off. Standing on that catwalk, I finally understood she had been asking the right question all along. I had made a career. I had made a name that classrooms studied. I had not always made room for the people alongside me, because I had decided so young that alongside was where the doubt lived, that if I let anyone close enough to help me, they would be close enough to see me falter. So I flew alone in the way that counts, long after the actual flight was over. Lone Lady. The squadron had named the day, but I had spent 20 years turning the day into a way of life, and no one had made me do that. I had chosen it, one guarded morning at a time, the same way Wade Hollis had chosen his loud mornings, and we had both arrived at the same lonely place from opposite directions. Then a message came in from the training command, from the weapons school, where my flight was still a slide in a dark room. They wanted the Lone Lady to come speak to the next class, and I sat with that request longer than it deserved on paper, because I finally understood that I had a choice about the story now. I could keep telling it the way the slide told it, the lonely lieutenant and the storm. Or I could tell it the way it was actually true. I stood on the catwalk with the message in my head and the sea black below me and the wing flying all around me in the dark, and I decided what I was going to say to a room full of young pilots who thought they already knew the story. I went. I stood at the front of that classroom, under my own slide, the same slide I had once stood behind unrecognized, and I looked out at a room of pilots so young that some of them had been in grade school when I flew that flight. Celine Ortiz was in that room, by the way. She had come off the sea tour, a real aviator, and was up for an instructor billet at the very school where her commander had once stood invisible at the back. And when our eyes met across the classroom, neither of us had to say anything at all. The thread had held. They call me Lone Lady, I told the class, and I earned that name on the worst day of my life. You've seen the slide, you know the flight, the storm, the downed lead, the wingman who couldn't see the boat. And I know exactly what you think this story is about because I thought it was about that too for a long time. You think it's a story about a pilot who was good enough to fly home alone. I let that sit. It is not, I said. It never was. It is a story about a 22-year-old who could not see anything and chose to trust a voice he could not verify. It is a story about the person on the wing, not the person leading. And my whole job standing here in front of you is to make sure that not one of you ever has to earn a name like mine the way I earned mine. Because the real lesson of that flight is not that I was alone. It is that he was not. Nobody flies home alone in my Navy. That is the entire point. If you take one thing out of this room, take that. A hand went up near the back. A young pilot, younger than I had been on the day of the flight, and he asked the question they always ask, the one I used to dread and have come to love. He asked if I had been afraid. I told him the truth. I told him I had been so afraid that I did not have room to feel it, which is a different thing than being brave, and that anyone who tells you they felt no fear on a day like that is either lying to you or was not paying attention. Fear is not the enemy, I told them. Fear is information. It tells you the stakes are real. The enemy is what fear does to your hands and your voice if you let it, the way it makes you grip too hard and talk too fast and fly into the sea. You do not get rid of the fear. You get a job to do that is bigger than the fear. And you do the job and you discover on the far side of it that the fear was there the whole time and you flew anyway. That is all courage has ever been. Not the absence of the thing, the work in spite of it. A young woman in the second row asked me the other question, the quiet one, the one I could tell she had been holding. She asked what you do when someone decides you do not belong. I looked at her for a moment because I knew that flinch, I had worn that flinch, and I gave her the same answer I had given a lieutenant junior grade on a flight deck months before. You fly anyway. You keep your dignity and you do the work and you let the flying be the argument and you do not become the small thing they mistook you for and you do not become cruel to prove you are more. You just fly anyway, and one morning the room stands up on its own. There was a chief once who tried to make me his punchline in front of a room he was sure would side with him. He is a better man now than he was that morning, and I had a small hand in that, and I am not sorry I did not break him when I easily could have. He sent me a note not long ago. He was not asking for anything, which is how I knew it was real. He just wanted to tell me that a junior sailor he had spent a year actually teaching, instead of performing for, had made chief, and that he had been proud to be a small part of it. I kept the note. It is not the kind of thing you frame. It is the kind of thing you keep. So here is what I know, after 20 years of being the unfamiliar woman in the doorway, after a career spent in the gap between a call sign everyone knew and a face no one did. Someone is going to look at you one day and decide, in half a second and with total confidence, that you are less than you are. They will be loud about it, and they may have an audience, and the room may even laugh. You will not be able to stop them from deciding it. But you get to decide what you do next, and that decision is the only part that was ever yours. You do not have to argue with them. You do not have to become smaller to fit the size they assigned you, and you do not have to become cruel to prove you are bigger. You do the work, you keep your dignity, you reach past the loud man to the kid he stepped on, because that is where you are actually needed. And when the moment comes, you say your true thing plainly, once and quietly, and you let the room stand up on its own. It will. I promise you it will. And you will not have had to say a word. If you've ever walked into a room and watched someone decide you were less than you are before you said a single word, I would love to hear how you handled it in the comments. Did you answer them straight, or did you let your work do the talking the way I learned to? And be honest with me. If you had been standing in that wardroom, would you have put the chief on report that same morning, or would you have done what I did? Tell me below. I read everyone. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and stay a while.